It's time for us to start looking at multiplayer development. There's a lot that goes into games, and if we want to build something that's multiplayer, it's important that we do it early on and that we don't try to slap it in later. It's a whole lot harder to convert a single player game to multiplayer than it is to build multiplayer from the start. So we're going to start really early by adding multiplayer support. We're going to change out our player and have our player use the new input system, which gives us some really great multiplayer capabilities out of the box. So we're going to start by importing the new input system and talking a little bit about it. So we're going to go to Window and go to Package Manager. And then we need to be in the Unity Registry Packages section. And then scroll down until we find the input system. You should be able to find it there, or just search for it and then choose install. Right now it's on 1.4.4. I expect there'll be lots more releases after this. We'll hit the install button. This should bring in the package and update our project really quickly, and it's going to give me a pop-up asking me if I want to restart the Unity editor to add support for the new input system. And I'm going to choose yes, because that's a required thing to make this actually work. We can't use the new input system until we allow Unity to restart. So give it a second. There it goes, popped up. Do you want to restart to allow the backends? We'll choose yes and give it just a second. Once it restarts, we'll have that new input system up and ready to go. There it goes. Oh, it looks like it gave me a nice little crash, and then it's going to reload. This happens a lot when I bring in packages and allow Unity to restart, or revert something and allow Unity to restart. That time I had to manually reopen Unity and reopen my project, but it's okay. Now it's up and running again. I expect that to happen when I pull in certain packages, or especially when I do reverting in source control. It sometimes happens. Doesn't happen every time, and shouldn't happen every time you pull in a package, but occasionally you're going to run into problems like that. Just restart Unity. All right, so I've got the new input system in, and nobody who isn't super familiar with it probably knows what that means. That's okay. What it means is that we're going to have a brand new, super powerful input system that allows us to do things that the current or existing input system doesn't allow us to do, or at least doesn't make it easy for us to do. The current input system is what we call a static class. That's why we write input with a capital I. Let's go take a quick look at it. We write input with a capital I dot get access. That's because this is a static class with a static method on it. That means that there's only ever one input, and it has all of these methods on it that have string names for them that we can get. So if I want to have a player 2, I need to have like a player 2 horizontal. I would need to go create that. I would need to write the code to find a player 2 horizontal, and I'd have to figure out how to map that all together. I have to do that for every single player and every single button. It's not there by default. If I go into edit in my project settings and I go find go find project settings and input manager, and I go look at these, you'll see that there's horizontal, vertical, and fire 1, 2, 3, but this is all just one player. There's not stuff for another player. The second horizontal and vertical here is just other inputs. This is joystick versions versus keyboard versions. We need something that's a lot more robust, and the new input system is exactly that. That's what it's there for. So what we're going to do is collapse the sprite render. I've got my player selected here in level 1, and we're going to add a new component. Hit add component, and we're going to search for player, and look at that. There's a player input and a player input manager script. Now, we're going to use the player input script. That's the component that's provided to us by the input system, and then expand it out. In here, you'll see that it has an actions field that's not assigned. It says none there. There's a button to create actions. We'll click that in just a moment. There's an option for the UI input module, for the camera. We'll talk about that in a moment, and for the behaviors. First thing we need to do is choose create actions. This is going to create what we call an action map. We're going to give it a folder that we want to put it in. I'm going to leave it in the default assets folder for now, and then allow it to pop up. So it's going to give us this input actions dialog window. And this window allows us to create and do mappings, kind of like that ugly window you saw a minute ago with the horizontal, vertical, and fire 1, 2, 3 did. But this one allows us to create multiple different action maps with multiple different actions and have them work differently across different devices. If I expand out and move, you'll see that it works with the left stick on the gamepad, WASD, the primary 2D access controller on an XR controller, or the stick on a joystick. Look is going to be like your right thumbstick, and your pointer movement pointer delta, so mouse look, and the hat switch on the joystick. And then fire is bound to right trigger, left mouse, primary, touch or tap on a touch screen, trigger on a joystick, or whatever the XR controller is. You can see we've got quite a few different bindings here for different devices, and it's much more I guess clean and generic. But the cool part about this is that we're not going to need to have multiple action maps for multiple players. We don't need to make a player 2 map or a move 2 action or anything like that. We're going to be able to have a single player input with this action map hook up to multiple different players with different inputs, work across keyboard and controller, all kind of automatically, and get split screen controls and everything as well. So what we need to do next is, well, if we press play, realize that nothing's going to happen. Let's hit play and let's see what it does. So we press play and we go in, we've got our player input script, and I can still move around just fine. And that's because by default, the input systems will now work together. If you enable the new input system, the old input system can still give you back input. You can still read the values and get the data out. That can be disabled though. It's an option in the player settings, but they've changed it, it looks like, to be both of them on by default. So I want to now start using the actual player input here though, instead of reading from the old input system. So we're going to open up our player script and we're going to make a couple of changes. The first thing that we need to do is get a reference to our player input in our awake method, because we're going to be using it every frame. So right after we get our rigid body, we'll add a new line, underscore player input equals get component, and we'll do of type, so the less than, player input with a capital P and a capital I, and then close that out with a greater than, open close parentheses, and our semicolon. This is going to get our player input component from the same object our player's on and cache it in this player input field that doesn't exist yet. So we'll click on it, hit Alt Enter, and generate the field. Should give us a field right up here by our other fields. I'm going to delete that private keyword and add a space after it so that it's separated from our non-component fields. So now we've got our player input. Let's copy that onto the clipboard, double click it and click Control C or Command C, and then let's go find the spots where we read input. So we've got input.getAxis horizontal. This is getting that X value of our horizontal, so our X value of our movement. Now, if we want to read that from our new input system, we need to get it from the move action instead of the get axis. So we're going to replace input.getAxis. I'm going to just select it all and hit delete, and then we'll paste in our player input. And we want to first do dot actions, and then we'll do a square brace, because the actions are actually an array that are indexed by name. So we give it, well, I don't know if it's actually an array. It might be stored as a dictionary or something else underneath, but it's some sort of a mapping that is indexed by array. So we do actions and we put a square brace, or by index. And then we give it a quotation marks and the name of the action, which is move. Let's go take a look at that again. So minimize our code. We'll go back into that action map. I'm going to go find our actions, just double click it and see that the name was move right here. M-O-V-E with a capital M. Now, if we go back to our code, we need to go to the end of the part where we get our action. So right now we've got our player input and we're going to reference the move action. So the next thing after the dot is going to be working on that move action. So we'll hit dot, and then we've got all of the properties and methods of the action, or of that, specifically of that move action. And what we want to do is read a vector2 value. And that's because a move input is a vector2 input. It has an up and down, or a left and right, and an up and down, or a horizontal and a vertical, or an X and a Y. So we're going to say read value, and we have to give it the type. We have to tell it very specifically that we want a vector2. If we give it the wrong type, we will get an error. So we have to make sure that this matches. And then we'll add our open close parentheses. And the final thing that we need is that we don't actually care about the X and Y input right here. We just care about the horizontal or the X value. So if we just do this, right now, we leave it like this, we're going to have an error down here because desired horizontal is a vector2, not a float. So we don't want this to be the vector2 with the X and the Y. We just want to get the X and assign that to the horizontal input. So we'll just do a dot X. Now we could save this vector off if we want to use the Y later, but right now we're not going to because we're not using it, and it would just be extra code that would be extra confusion. So now we've got our move value read from the vector. Let's go down and check the other two spots where we read our input. I said from the vector, from the new input system, from the player input. So we've got our, where's our inputs? So here's what I'll do. There we go. just have it pop up right in front of me. So for our fire 1 button, or our beginning of our jump, we're going to replace the input.get button down, fire 1, all the way to there. Do underscore player input. And here again, we need to get the action for our fire. So we'll do actions, quote, fire. It's not fire 1 because we don't have a fire 1. We just have a fire action. Let's go take one quick peek at that. So look here, it's fire, and we're going to add a jump action shortly after this. But we'll add a fire action. And we'll say dot performed, let's see, this frame. So there we go, was performed this frame. There's already exists on there, and this will tell us whether or not the fire action was performed on this frame, so whether or not they started pressing fire during this frame. Now on line 74, we check to see if they're still holding the fire button down. To determine that, we have actually a couple options. There's an event system that allow us to know when they started and stopped pressing it. But for now, we're just going to read the actual raw value of the fire button to see if the value is greater than 0 or if the button is still being held down. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. Let's copy the code from player input all the way up to the end of the square brace for fire, Control C, and then I'm going to replace it over input.get button fire 1, so Control V. It should look just like this: input, player input dot actions, and then square brace, quotes fire with capital F and closing quotes and a square brace, and then we'll say dot read value, and we're going to read a float. Just like we read a vector 2 there, we're going to read a float from our button. And when you look at the button mapping, remember that the trigger is one of the buttons. So buttons are actually going to return back a value between 0 and 1, depending on how pushed down they are. It's going to assume that every button has the capability to be dynamic or variable, but all the buttons will work as a single button, even if they're just on or off. It'll just go from 0 to 1 instantly. So we've got our read value, and we need to open close parentheses to actually call that read value method, telling it that we want to type a float. And it still has an error here because we can't check to see if a float is true or false. We have to make sure that this value is actually greater than something else. So we'll check to see if the value from fire 1 is greater than 0 and our jump time is still greater than end time. So we can still continue jumping. So this is just replacing our input reading to use that player input. Let's save, get rid of the star there, and then jump over to Unity and see if it works and if our mappings are all working. And then if it is, it should feel just about the same, like there's not really much difference yet. Let's see if that's the case. In fact, there probably shouldn't really feel like any difference. I can run left and right, I can jump up and down, but interestingly, I can't, oh, there we go. Now I can move on the controller once I get the controller on. So now I can bounce around and move on the controller or move on the keyboard, and everything's working using the new input system. Let's stop playing, go to plastic, and say that we've upgraded our game to use the new input system. First, let's save our scene. So, well, let's say switched game to use new input system, and check in our changes.